Yeah,
And
it's also sorry,
yeah,
I was just going to say it's also closely related to a bill called HR 875,
Yeah, could
the
you
banning or the criminalisation of organic farming.
could you
yes.
tell us
Well,
about that?
yeah, what it is you're talking about the food safety bill in the States?
Yeah,
Yes.
In America? Right. Well, actually, with the as in Britain, the two house system of supposed representation, but it's really a joke these days. There is no representation in the U.S., not politically. The House passed a bill, a food safety bill, Modernization Act of 2009, which, of course, if you ever hear the name of a bill, any legislation these days, I don't care if it's in the UK or in the United States or Canada, and it says something like Save the Children Act, you can be sure more children will die. If it's food safety, you can be sure the food supply will be less safe. If it's stop the drug wars, then it's going to be, or stop the drug import, then you can be sure there will be more drugs imported into the country, that sort of thing. So
yeah.
just a
Paul
clue to the
Welly
list.
reverse speak, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And so in this case, what they want to do is engage in top to bottom control of the American food supply system from the smallest, and I do mean smallest, farm ranch food producer to the largest. But of course, the largest ones, the agribusinesses, they can afford to pay attorneys and accountants and lobbyists and the like to take care of the books and records to make sure they're on top, or even just to bribe the regulators. Whereas the small guys and gals, they aren't going to have that kind of money, so they'll be driven out of business. So this will enhance the aggregation of the food supply into a few powerful hands that are already what I call in the fatal embrace with the government.
Yeah,
And
it's essentially fascism, isn't it?
it is, and I was going to say that, but so many people see that as a tired, trite, cliched word, but it's really an accurate description of the political system in most countries of the world, whether it's Russia, whether it's Canada, whether it's the U.S., whether it's even the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with you. One of the things, if we can just go back slightly, when we were talking about I'm starting to lose my thread with
No,
Codex.
that's right. What about Codex or about
Yeah,
the...
it was in relation to Codex, and I've heard people dismiss the whole issue of Codex because it's only produces guidelines, but countries themselves are actually sign treaties binding them to these guidelines, so they become there's an element of compulsion in there that, on the next step rather than at its inception. Codex itself can't force anything, can it? But if it creates the agenda, then countries can voluntarily bind themselves to these rules.
Right, and they have done it. No, that's very well put, and I agree with what you said. Essentially, Codex is just these, and they even say it themselves, voluntary guidelines. But the interesting thing, and I say this in my talks, is if you look at the Codex Alimentarius Commission Strategic Plan, 2008-2013, this is their latest document. I'm looking at it right now as we speak on your program. And you go to page 1, they have their strategic, their strategic vision statement. And if you don't mind, it's about 3 sentences, or maybe 2, and I'll read it to you.
Please.
It says, the Codex Alimentarius Commission envisions a world afforded the highest attainable levels of consumer protection, including food safety and quality, period. To this end, the Commission will develop internationally agreed standards and related texts for use, and now listen to this, in domestic regulation and international trade in food that are based on scientific principles and fulfill the objectives of consumer health protection and fair practices in food trade, blah, 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 throw up. So, but the important
so their own
point...
mission statements acknowledging that it will be turned into state or national regulation.
Exactly, and they say it throughout this document as well. I just read you the first most important instance in it, but there are others where they want to promote and this is a quote from page 4, to continue to promote national regulatory systems that are based on international principles and guidelines, etc. So what you have in the case of the UK especially, and the EU countries, is you're locked in through your obligations through the Maastricht Treaty and through other treaty obligations. You're locked in through the technical barriers in trade agreement. You're locked in through the sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, all of which Britain is a signatory to, and as well as any number of other things. And then what they do, and they've done this in the States, is they sneak into national legislation various mentions, like in the CAFTA agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, they to Codex guidelines and standards. So whereas we have domestic legislation in place in America that protects us, almost with the snap of fingers, they could override it. They just know that this is sort of the third rail of nutritional politics in the U.S., and they have to do an end run around it. It's sort of what I call the Maginot Line mentality, where in some cases, and now I'm getting back to what you were talking about there, and that is that a lot of people say this isn't a threat because they have this Maginot mentality. They've constructed some domestic legislation which mirrors the Maginot Line, which was supposed to defend France against Germany in the 30s at great expense. But what they didn't realize is the Germans would do an end run around the Maginot Line and come through the Ardennes forest and take France in a few weeks. And so this is the same sort of mentality that's going on with a lot of the trade organizations in various countries. The International Alliance of Dietary Food Supplement Associations, IADSA, has this mentality as well, although actually I think it's been taken over by pharmaceutical interests, but that's my opinion. But in any event, there are a lot of, for the honest players, there's a lot of this mentality that, it can't happen here. This is Britain, this is America, it won't happen here, but they're going to do an end run through these international treaties and institute these guidelines that have been adopted by these really third-level bureaucrats and functionaries who have zero interest in health freedom, every interest in controlling the heck out of you, and this is all being done offshore in the dark and with very little notice.
Yeah, I was thinking it's interesting you were saying that the English or UK delegate rarely speaks up, because that would be, in fact, the case that we are bound to Codex Alimentarius by the European Union treaties, which take precedent over national law. So that essentially the UK state has very little to say about anything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. The typical Englishman, Englishwoman thinks of freedom in a sense different than the typical American at least used to. Because of the fights between royalty, between Crown and Parliament back in, of course, with the English Civil War, and then the victory of the parliamentarians, the Roundheads then, liberty and freedom was thought of as representation in Parliament. So this led to a really bad mentality, which is, well, if Parliament voted for it, then it's okay because we elected our representatives and our representatives in turn voted for this, so that's freedom. It doesn't matter that they trample on the rights of individuals. There was common law to help protect individual Englishmen and all of that from rampages of Parliament for a long time, but that has long since gone by the by after the First World War. But in America, it was always thought that it was a constitutional republic, and you weren't considered free just because you elected a representative. You were considered free because it was sort of taking it a notch above our English roots. You were considered free because your rights, your individual rights, were protected. And but that has eroded so much now that, like the UK and like so many other parliaments, we think, because it was voted on, then it's okay. It's the old analogy of what's democracy. It's two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. And that's what they're doing. So I am not a Democrat with a little d. I think democracy can be tyranny every bit as much as aristocracy or monarchy. In fact, sometimes worse, because it's supposed to have more legitimacy. Individual rights must be protected. Private property must be respected. I mean, you just think about Britain, this little island in the North Atlantic. It was impossible. I mean, think about it. It was colonized by the Romans. It was marauded for centuries by its neighbors. And yet, despite all that, it grew and arose to essentially conquer the world and spread its culture and its language throughout the world. And then one of its colonies, the United States, arose and continued the advance. I mean, that's a remarkable story. How did that happen? This little island that was so beset upon by everyone, and it arose. Well, it did it because of the common law, because it had three main components. It had rule of law through basically non-corrupt court system, judicial system. It respected private property, and it had a free market. And those three things led it to really conquer the world, a nation of shopkeepers that beat Napoleon cold. So now,
you said that punch above our weight, isn't it? But when you describe it from an American's point of view, it does sound implausible at best, doesn't it?
It does, but it's the same story as Hong Kong. You think about Hong Kong as well. You know, freedom is not only morally right, it's practically right. You don't make advances in civilization, you don't make advances in science without freedom. So what these morons are doing by imposing all these controls and locking down on us is they're shutting us into a medieval mentality, and it's going to retard progress. It's going to kill millions of people planet-wide. And the people who aren't killed outright will have shortened and less happy and less healthful lives because of it. So unless we stop them, unless we can unleash freedom, this is our future. But if you look at Hong Kong, no natural resources, 1949, you have scores of refugees fleeing Red China, just conquered by the People's Republic, or People's Army, People's Liberation Army, and they literally go swimming across or boating across to, or in some cases walking to Hong Kong. And because it had the benefit of being a British colony, it had those three essential items I just mentioned. You know, rule of law, respect for private property, and a free market system, and a very light governing hand by Great Britain. You compare it to Brazil, heavy regulations, tons of natural resources, tons of land. You'd think it'd be far more successful than Hong Kong. And yet, in 50 years' time, Hong Kong has so far outstripped Brazil that its gross domestic product is 5 times that of the average Brazilian, even with all that wealth of resources. And what accounts for the difference? You didn't have a true free market in Brazil. You didn't have an incorruptible court system. You didn't have respect for private property. People could come and seize your property, could come seize your wealth if they wanted it, because they were just more powerful and they had the police on their side. Now Brazil has started to change, so it's advancing at last, but that shows you what freedom can really do and why it's so important.